I'm Samantha Scheinman, the Vice President of the Society, which was founded in 1955 to conserve and to foster greater knowledge of the natural resources of Arkansas, focusing on Arkansas's birds. Specifically, the Society promotes research through our trust, conservation through our bird records and bird-friendly yard initiative, and finally education through our youth ecology camps. Also with us tonight, we have a special visitor all the way from the U.S. Virgin Islands, and that's Don Spencer. So wish him a warm welcome. We have a wonderful weekend planned for you, filled with birding and fellowship with other birders. Could anything be better? I heard a no. Note that field trip sign-up forms are in the back, along with silent auction items. The proceeds from those silent auction items benefit the Iola Ray Fund, and that allows campers to go to these conventions in the spring. Is that right? Wonderful. And there are also some free items on the field trips table, so take a look at those. Let's see, am I missing anything? All right, one of our members, Donna Haynes, will introduce our evening guest speaker, Kevin Morgan.
Hi guys. I think most of you, or well, some of you might recognize this bird. That's Rufy. And this is not working. Okay, sorry about that. You guys may remember it actually 8 years ago today, as an immature Rufus hummingbird, he arrived at our home, and a lot of you guys came to our home to see him. The bird, we later named him Rufy, and he began our obsession with the winter hummingbird phenomenon. In the following year, Rufy returned to our home in August, and that's when this picture was taken. You can see there's flowers waving behind him and everything. And shortly thereafter, that's when I met our speaker, Kevin Morgan, through a post that I had made on Facebook about Rufy. And his work with Nancy Newfield studying overwintering hummingbirds in Louisiana really fascinated me and prompted endless questions on my part. And Kevin, he's always very gracious, and he took the time to answer all those questions, and he still does, because I'm still always asking him questions. He and I also co-moderate a Facebook group called Winter Hummingbirds, which is focused on recording wintering hummingbird sightings in the eastern half of the United States and providing information regarding research and the feeding of these birds. And I'm very excited to have finally met Kevin in person today. We've known each other about 7 years digitally, and now we finally met in person. Kevin's going to present 40 years of the Jewels of Winter, the Louisiana Winter Hummingbird Project tonight. 40 years ago, Nancy Newfield embarked on a study to determine whether the hummingbirds she and a few others were regularly reporting throughout the winter months were simply birds that failed to migrate or visitors from elsewhere, and to prove whether or not they actually survived the winters and possibly returned in future years. Kevin, he's a lifelong birder. He also developed a particular interest in hummingbirds in high school back in the 1970s. And he dove back into that subject at the start of the century. He crossed paths with Nancy Newfield, who had developed the Louisiana Winter Hummingbird Project to study the then almost unheard of phenomenon of the winter hummingbirds. He also has a day job, and he bends that as much as he can around the opportunity to work with the study. And he does serve as the data manager and the scheduling coordinator for the last several years for the project. Now, this study has inspired similar research efforts across much of the eastern United States and has answered some of the questions and has raised more in the process, and some of which Kevin's going to share with us tonight. So, welcome, Kevin.
I'm not used to walking around with the microphone, so I'm going to leave it here and hope that the technology works. So, back when I was 12 years old or thereabouts, my family moved out to what we call the country. And in Baton Rouge, that meant the outskirts. It was not exactly the suburbs that it is today. It was one of those places where it's 7 miles to the nearest grocery store and so forth. So there wasn't a whole lot to do other than entertain yourself. And somewhere along the way, one of my older sisters discovered that there was a thing called 4-H, and my mother, being no dummy, said, "Oh, this is something I could dump all the kids into," and then they were all taken care of at one time. I'm not one of those that is particularly inspired by getting up at 5 in the morning and trying to milk a cow or birth a lamb or something like that. So I looked around for other projects, and I decided that, oh, this thing called conservation would be kind of good, and one of the areas that you could focus on was birds. So I decided, okay, I'll become a bird watcher. And that was in 1976, so 42 years later, I'm still sort of going at it. Back in those days, there were very little known about the phenomenon of winter hummingbirds. But there was one intrepid soul who decided to get involved with it, and that's where we come in with the winter hummingbird project. So way back, going back even further than that, all the way to the 1930s, that's when we detected, Louisiana had its first winter hummingbirds. First was a rufous that was discovered in 1934. It was actually found inside the Senate chamber of the state capitol. Somehow it got inside in January. About 4 years later, a second one showed up, and then that was it for rufous hummingbirds for a number of years. First ruby-throated discovered in the wintertime was reported also that same year in 1934. That's pretty much what we thought there was. Just, a ruby-throat or two that didn't migrate, and some lost rufous that just happened to turn up, instead of going to Mexico, showed up in Louisiana. The assumption was that all of these birds were just hopelessly lost, or that the birds that were here and just failed to migrate, and they would die. But then in the 1950s, they recorded the first broadtail, which is a species that occurs in the Rocky Mountains. The same person had another rufous in her yard at the time. And by this point, they had decided that rufous were actually regular but rare winter visitors that would show up in October, November. But again, no one knew whether they were staying around. It's just they would show up, there was a freeze, flowers died, people didn't see them anymore. But occasionally one would show up through the spring and said, well, maybe some would survive, but we just don't know. In the 1950s, first black-tooth showed up a few years later in the same yard where the first broadtail showed up. They had ruby throats. By this point, they were still being assumed as birds failing to migrate. Ruby throats and black chins were assumed that you couldn't tell them apart if they were female or if they were young birds. Of course, you could tell them adult males. But then in the 60s, we started getting other things. The first buck-bellied showed up in 1965, and then there was another one in 1973. Rufous by this point is pretty much a regular bird. You can see one almost any year you want to see one. I had one in 1978. I didn't know to report it to anybody because this is, of course, before the internet, before there were rare bird groups. There were no phone lines to call and report these things, so I just made a note that I had a rufous hummingbird in my little handwritten notes and went on about my business. At this point, there were also 8 records of black chins, and people were starting to realize maybe some of these ruby throats we're seeing in the winter, the female ones, might be black chins instead. We just don't know. Then in 1975, the first Allen showed up. Rufous are still uncommon but regular. Several people are reporting them year after year after year. And in the fall of 1976, Nancy Newfield, who was a December, she had 7 in her yard. She mentioned this at the Christmas count that year, that she had black chins. Someone said, "How many?" She said, 7. Someone blurted out from the other end of the table, "That's a lie! Nobody can have that many." And she says she grew up with brothers. She was going to show him. A couple of years later, she got her first buck belly, which was the 4th state record. She also got her first broadtail, which was the 2nd state record in 1978. She got her first Allens, also that same year. That's the 2nd state record. The first Abbott showed up in 1979, not in her yard, but also in Louisiana. She said, "Something is going on. Nobody can be this lucky." Actually, she said, "Nobody can be this damn lucky," but I don't put that in print form. So she said, "Someone needs to study this." And she, at this point, was becoming known in the birding community. There is an institution at LSU called the Museum of Natural Sciences, which is one of the largest ornithological research programs in the country. And so she approached them about doing a project. She said that a master's student should come and study this, in Louisiana, look into what these birds are doing here, where they're coming from, and so forth. And their response was, as she put it, polite disinterest. They told her, "Our students come to LSU because they want to go to South America and discover species new to science. They're not going to be interested in, looking at a few hummingbirds in someone's yards in Louisiana." They said, "Why don't you do it?" She said, "Well, I'm a college dropout. I got, dropped out of my junior year to get married. I don't know anything about this." And they said, "We'll teach you." So she set up a program where she planned to do a 5-year research into the wintering hummingbirds by banding them and documenting them, and wanted to answer the following questions. Do winter hummingbirds survive in the wintertime? Do they return in subsequent years to the same site, either as breeding birds if they were ruby throats, for example, or do the winterers come back winter after winter? How long do they live? And where do they come from? Because we know that, for example, rufous are coming from somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. We know that black chins are coming from somewhere west of the Great Plains. We don't know where the ruby throats are coming from. Are they our birds? Are they birds from elsewhere? But that's what we want to know. Why are they coming to Louisiana? So she set up to start doing banding. It took her almost a year to get her permit because there were not that many hummingbird banders at the time. She was the 12th person in the entire North American continent to get a permit to ban hummingbirds. The closest person doing it was somewhere in Oklahoma, so there was no one to train her. So they sent her to bands. She was able to work with specimens at LSU to learn the techniques and so forth, and she became the 12th band. This is how our bands come. I don't know if any of you have been to banding in the past, especially for passerines or larger birds, but the bands for all other birds come as little round, aluminum bands that can be just slipped onto the bird and closed. These are too small, and because they have to vary in size depending on the species of hummingbird, they come printed on sheets like this. This is 200 bands on a sheet of aluminum. They have to be cut out carefully and then shaped around a little jig that is like a nail sticking up from the board, and that's how big they are. So you can imagine it's very tedious work. But the banders make the bands. We can even catch the birds in a mist net, which is fairly safe, although kind of, scary looking thing for a moment. The nets can't really hurt the birds, but it does require taking them out carefully. Or we can trap them. We don't usually use mist nets in general because we're not licensed to ban anything but hummingbirds. And we would be running out in the wintertime, we would be running out there every 5 minutes to pull chickadees and goldfinches and cardinals and everything else out of the net and releasing them. And of course, every time you run outside to do these things, you're spooking the birds away from the feeder. So mostly we use traps. We have different designs of traps. The first kind over here on the left is one where the door on the trap comes down once the bird is inside the trap with the feeder. They're remote controlled. One on the far right is a similar design, except that the trap door just swings shut downwards. We also have traps where the whole thing is like a mesh that drops down over around the feeder when the bird is inside. Put the band on, that's what it looks like on the bird. We check for verifying what species it is, because once it's in hand, sometimes you can see little things like, is it a black-chinned or a ruby throat? Is it an Allen's versus a rufous, and so forth. We look at the fat score, which is what you're seeing here. We blow the feathers aside, and you can see how much fat they're carrying. Actually, we think that when the birds are sedentary, they would be fat, and when they're moving, they're thin, but it's actually the other way around. They pack on fat that they can use to burn in migration, so they can fly long distances without stopping to feed, but there's usually no fat on them while they're resident for the winter in somebody's garden. Then we record the age and sex. We look for moles. You can see here on the bird on the left, all those little white things coming in are cheek feathers that are going to be a fresh, new, bright red gorget on this bird. You can also see that on the bird on the left, the wing feathers are molting in. They replace the bird with the feathers all over the course of the winter from the inside out. So that gives us an idea of how long it's going to be before they're ready to leave, because once they finish their migrating, the molt in their wings, then they're usually within a week or two of ready to head on. We take measurements. We measure the length of the bill, which helps us confirm the identity of Allen's versus rufous and black-chinned versus ruby throats. We measure the length of the wing, and we measure the length of the tail. And all of those things vary from bird to bird, but they vary within a given range. And so we're able to plot that against statistical information and say, yes, okay, this one is definitely a rufous because it's too big or too small or whatever to be one of the Allen's. Same with the black-chinned. Sometimes we can pick those out, just look at it and say, man, that bird's got a big bill. And you realize, oh, okay, it's almost certainly a black-chinned. Then we can color mark the birds. One of the few things, not all banders have a permit for this, but we almost have to do this in Louisiana because we get oftentimes multiple birds of the same species in the same yard, and the only way for the homeowner to be sure if they get a new bird is if it's not marked from when the birds they already have. So in the early years, the project was set up with just a single band, which was Nancy. She covered the entire lower third of the state of Louisiana. You can see on the map how big of an area that is. She would band over here from Cameron, which is in the lower left-hand corner, all the way through the New Orleans area, and then down into the bottom of the Delta. Way down that way, there were people who had winter hummingbirds as well. So she's put sometimes, 30,000, 40,000 miles on her vehicle in the course of a winter or two, just going house to house in order to get as many birds as you could. Because there weren't a whole lot of them at the beginning. 1979 and 1980, which was the first year she was permitted to band, she banded 20 birds of 3 species. Those would have been ruby throat, black-chinned, and rufous, I believe. 1980, that's 56. The next year, unfortunately, I believe there was a hard freeze that year, and she had some prior commitments to some things. She's didn't get out to band nearly as much. By the time we did, a lot of birds moved on to freeze, but then the numbers started picking back up again. You can see we're going through next 5 years, still have small numbers relatively, but we started seeing peaks and valleys. The birds would go number one per year, two, then they go down, go up for a few years, go down. The species diversity was growing. In 84, 85, we had 3 species. Next year we had 4. Next year we had 5. Next year we had 8. Next year we dropped back down to 5 again. So you can start to see this is the first 10 years. Numbers go up, going down, up, down, up, down. You see it's gradually a progression towards more and more birds each year. Then, first calliope was discovered in Louisiana. First record in the United States after October anywhere. When Nancy called the museum to report that she thought that there was a calliope at somebody's house, they took the information down and she needed to call back for something. She called back and she could hear somebody in the background saying, Nancy thinks she's got a calliope someplace. And you heard this uproarious laughter. People were like, you're right. Well, they came down anyway just to see. And sure enough, they found a calliope. At this point, we're starting to seeing the same season recaptures. It first took several years before we would be able to catch the birds again the same year because Nancy would not be able to get to everybody's house on a regular basis. I mean, she was raising kids. She had 2 daughters. She said she started getting insomnia when the first one turned 15 because she didn't know if there was trouble to be gotten into. She was getting into it. And so you get stressed with the ordinary life things going on. But we got more and more time available to work on these things. And in 1985, we got the first second-year returnee or captions a year after it was banded. That was final proof we needed that the birds do survive, and they return to their breeding grounds and come back. And we not only proved that they come back, but they come back often to the exact same yard. We're talking about, with rufous, these are birds that breed up in the Pacific Northwest, and they get back to us in the same yard in South Louisiana with no GPS, no road map, and some of them are even made. So, you know, it's surprising, but, you know, they don't have to stop and ask for directions, apparently, and they still make it. Going into the 90s, there were a couple of, this first year was a really, really slow year, mostly because Nancy suffered a house fire and was not able to get out of band as much. They were rebuilding the house. Her husband was, you know, tied up with that sort of, you know, working on the getting their lives back together. But very quickly got back into the swing of things. We had 6 species the next year, including the first broad bill. See, as we're going through, numbers are starting to get, you know, routine to getting in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and such. In 1995, it jumps up to 188. And this is what happens when you have help. That was the year that Nancy's first sub-permit evander came online, was able to work sites independently from her. So he covered stuff in the western half of the state. She covered things in the eastern half of the state. And you can see that even though the numbers still go up and down, they're able to get a whole lot more birds. And by this point, we're seeing a minimum of 6 species every year, sometimes 7, sometimes 8. And then 1999, 2000 comes along, and we're routinely up in the upper 100s, almost 200 range. And the other full-time, or not full-time, the other permitted bandit comes online. We've got